go to your class. This session is being recorded, so if you need to miss the end, you can catch it later. But there is unfortunately a conflict with the class, so just make sure you are attending your 3:30 class. So I will pass it over to Kevin. So Kevin Graham is here with us from the Children's Aid Society to talk about the duty to report. So Kevin, we just spent the last hour with Amelia learning about gender-based violence prevention and education. So we talked a lot about inclusive classrooms and creating a culture of consent. And now we're going to move a little bit into what the protocol and process looks like and expectation for teachers with the duty to report, coming a little bit more from your end, and obviously not only relating to gender-based and sexual violence, but including lots of other areas that I'm sure you might go into more as well. So I will pass it off to you. And folks, if you do have questions throughout the presentation, Kevin has said that he's open to questions. So just feel free to put those in the Q&A box and I'll read them at appropriate times as they come through. Otherwise, we can save some for the end. But at this point, we are recording again and I will pass it over to Kevin. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Erin, for inviting me this afternoon. And there is some, there'll be not a lot of overlap, but there's certainly subject-wise, there's some overlap with the previous presentation, and that'll become evident hopefully through some of what I'm going to cover in this presentation. I'll introduce myself really quickly first, just so you have an idea what my background is. It may inform some questions or give you an idea what I might be able to speak to. So I graduated from King's at Western many years ago with a BSW, and then I went to Laurier for my MSW, and I'm a registered social worker. So I've actually worked at Children's Aid for my entire career. I did a field placement for Children's Aid in my last year placement at King's College, and I've worked there basically ever since. So I worked on the front line in what's called ongoing services for about 10 years, and that's working front line with families, going into homes, working and supporting families, doing legal work, court work, things like that. And then I've been a supervisor. We call our department different names. Sometimes we call it intake or assessment or investigation. Currently, we're called the assessment unit. So I've been a supervisor in that unit for many years. And I also am one of the emergency after hours supervisors. So kind of a week at a time, every 5 weeks or so, I'm on call nights and weekends for any crisis things are going on. So that's just super quick, my background. As I say, it might help you with questions and things. Just so you know, the PowerPoint slide presentation I'm doing it's not one I designed myself. It's designed by some senior people at our agency and also our umbrella organization, the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. So there's a massive amount of material covered from a teaching perspective. It's kind of ironic in a way because the slides I think are good in a way. There's a ton of information on them, but from a teaching perspective, there's basically too much information to cover in an hour and a half. So I will be glossing over some things. I usually, in the past, I've done these presentations for a personal support worker program at Fanshawe. In speaking with you today, I'll try and emphasize some things that are more specific to teachers. But as I say, I will be glossing over some things. It's you're still responsible for the material, and there's a ton of information. You'll get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. It'll get emailed out after the fact. But I'd rather be able to answer some questions and focus on some teacher specific things because it's impossible basically to cover all the content that's in these slides. If at any time, and as I say, you'd still be responsible for the material is my understanding, but sometimes some of the examples used or just some of the information that I'll be covering can be upsetting for people. It could bring up possibly some past experiences or some personal experiences or professional experiences that you might have had. I always want to make it really clear if someone needs to step out of the presentation and then return when they feel able to, or if you're not able to return, you're not able to return, and you can arrange to catch up on the material later on. If someone's having a particularly difficult time at the end, I can make sure that I help connect people if there's counseling or any crisis resources that I can help connect people with. I'm certainly able and willing to do that at the end if there's a need for that. The Last thing I'll say before I get into the presentation itself, despite the information rich content of the slides and what I'll be talking about, there's a number of things it doesn't really cover. It doesn't talk much about reporting possible child protection concerns about parents who have mental health issues, addictions issues, lack of supervision, whether that's inside the home or out in the community. Doesn't really cover parents at risk of abandoning their children, a lot of times with sometimes with latency age kids, but also with adolescents. Sometimes parents just feel they've tried everything and it's not working, and they're completely at their end of the rope and are thinking there's no other option but to have their kids come into our care. So the presentation doesn't talk a lot about that, but if you're aware of circumstances to do with those areas, lack of medical treatments, another thing that's not really covered, lack of uh, parents ensuring kids have access to like developmental treatment for some kind of a developmental condition or an emotional psychiatric condition. Presentation doesn't really cover that, but again, they're reportable grounds under the Child and Youth Family Services Act that we work under. So I'll just start moving along through the presentation now. Some things, as I say, I'll gloss over with. There's advantages and disadvantages to the way children's aid is structured. There's about 50 children's aids in the province. Some are specifically work with Indigenous families. In Toronto, there's Jewish Child and Family Services. Toronto and Hamilton have a Catholic children's aid that's separate as well. In London, there's only the one children's aid. Our Indigenous communities working towards having their own equivalent of children's aid, but it's not there yet. So in London, it's basically the one place to call, regardless of what identities people may have. And it's a 24-hour service, 365 days a year. Most of our calls from teachers, the vast majority, come in during the day, but there are sometimes different circumstances. A teacher might become aware of something after hours, and by calling our main number, which is easy to find, you can get patched through directly to our answering service, and then a call goes out to one of our emergency workers and they can get in touch with you, even if it's after hours, or doesn't usually happen on a stat holiday, but it might, you never know. The advantage of having separate children's aids all through the province is each children's aid can be more responsive to its particular community. Different communities have different makeup of people from different cultural backgrounds or different issues. There might be more housing issues in one community versus another. So because we have an independent board of directors, we can gauge our service more so than we likely could if the province was directly, if we were direct government employees. And as I mentioned, this presentation was partly put together by the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. Most children's aids belong to that. So we cover generally kids and youth up to the age of 18. We do offer some services up to age 21 and even sometimes beyond 21 and some special circumstances during the pandemic. Fortunately, the government has let us extend kids who would have usually, as we call, aged out of our care. They've let us keep working with them because there were so many additional challenges with the pandemic. But generally, the age of protection is up to 18 years old. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And clearly, teachers, it's kind of obvious, but in just working with kids, I mean, teachers spend so much time with kids during the day and get to know their kids in their classes extremely well, or kids that you're working with in some other capacity in your role. So, and also having a lot of contact with parents, but pick up, drop off time, resolving problems or whatever the issue may be, you're going to get to know kids and families quite well. So you're in a pretty unique position actually to be aware of when a family might be struggling with a certain issue, or if a child is struggling with something or has been harmed some way, or you think there's a significant risk that a child might be potentially harmed some way based on your interactions with the child or what you're hearing from other kids in the class or potentially other parents. There's all kinds of ways you might get that information. And we really stress that Children's Aid obviously has a huge amount of responsibility for keeping kids safe, but as the years go by, the emphasis is so much on being a community responsibility. Part of that responsibility is in terms of reporting, but another huge part of the community responsibility is supporting families, because Children's Aid can't possibly provide all the support that's needed to all the kids we work with. So London's fortunate in a lot of ways. We have a lot of resources, a lot of community resources available, and some quite specialized ones. Just one quick example, there's a place called the Muslim Resource Center, and they've been operating in London now for quite a few years. We have a close partnership with that agency. So things might not be necessarily serious enough that Children's Aid needs to be involved long term, but the Muslim Resource Center has a ton of services, and they can provide counseling or groups or problem solving around all kinds of complicated, quite serious issues. That's just one example. There's many agencies in London that we have partnerships with as well. Work closely with public health, place called Marymount Children's Center, which is an excellent parenting resource. There's CPRI and Thames Valley Children's Center. I'm just kind of listing off places, but there's just a ton of resources in London. So we're fairly resource rich. Having said that, there's unfortunately a lot of waiting lists. So things could always be better, but part of our role is a case management role to coordinate services provided by different agencies or collect information to be a case manager, so that everyone knows what the important information is and there's not overlap and duplication about how families are being serviced, because it's not unusual at all for a few different professionals to be involved with the family, including the school and the teacher if they're school age kids. And two, the other quick mention, we rely on the community hugely for foster parents, family and friends of, like we call it kinship, but family members and close friends of family we rely on hugely. We have a lot of volunteers. We're often looking for volunteers. The most common ones we use are volunteer drivers. They drive literally hundreds of thousands of kilometers to try and help, because you can imagine the kids that are in our care have so many appointments. So we have a huge need for volunteer drivers, tutors. We have since you're at Althouse, I'll mention this. We have actually quite a good program for our kids in care and some kids out of care, but we have some, we call them educational consultants, and they're retired special ed teachers or principals or vice principals, but they're actually on staff with us, and they know the education system backwards and forwards. So they really advocate for our kids to be getting what they need in the school system, as whether it's assessments or specialized resources, or they can assist with some difficult meetings, problem solving meetings. So we have pretty good access to these. We have a few of these educational consultants, and they're streamed by kids of different ages. So some specialize more in like primary, junior, and then the high school kids. So we've got a few people in each, depending on their work experience, focuses on a certain age group. So that's something I just want to especially mention. And they run for, I think it's for older kids, they run like night classes, and it can be difficult to engage some of the adolescents in those classes, but the former educational professionals that we have on staff, they're amazing, and they're gifted at making connections with kids. And if there's any way, they're persistent. So if they can, again, this is for the kids who are in our care, but a lot of times those kids move around a lot and have a lot of school placement disruption. So they get behind because life has kind of got in the way. So we didn't used to have those resources, 15 years ago, but we've had them for quite a few years now. So it's a huge resource that we have, just so you're aware of that. This is something we've been spending a lot of time on the last few years, is certain populations are overrepresented, and it's not because certain populations have more issues or more serious issues. examples that always come to light are people from our Indigenous community, and also people who identify as Black. So because of bias in reporting, we actually would get more referrals to do with Indigenous people and Black people. And once there's a referral made, there's a lot of focus put on the family and a lot of scrutiny, for want of a better word, than would be put on people who a referral wasn't made about. And referral sources can have their own biases, and unfortunately some of our people working for us can also have biases, so things can kind of snowball. So we have, I'm not sure the percentages offhand, but it's not just like a 2 or 3% difference. It's like tens of percent difference as far as compared to how many people, Indigenous people, would be in the sort of population at large. Indigenous people would be maybe roughly 30 or 40%, and similar for Black families. They're that much higher represented in the people we're working with, and also in the kids who are in our care. And not many, we'll get to this later, a very small percent of the kids we work with are actually in our care. But if you look at who is in care, those groups of people are quite overrepresented. So there's been a huge focus on working with that over the years. If you do think, when you are making referrals, and everyone has some kind of biases or makes some kinds of judgments that may not be fair just based on your own life experience. But if you can, as best you possibly can, just kind of try and run your own checks and balances, as far as if you think there really is a concern, or is some of your thinking or some of your concerns may be influenced by some assumptions or some stereotypes about what may be a more common issue in a certain population. And the awareness is important. Our staff have gone through, basically all our staff in the last couple of years have gone through pretty intense training, and it has changed the way we're looking at things. And I'm saying this because if you do make a referral, it's not unusual on our phone screeners, we call them, they need to factor in for every referral. They need to try and tease out, is the referral source, whether it's a professional person or a neighbor, general community member, is there some kind of fairly obvious bias that's coming out? Sometimes it's crystal clear, because some people, unfortunately, when they're making, we can get a neighbor calling and there's clearly racist elements to what they're saying, and it's not hard to figure out. Sometimes it can be more subtle. So that's just part of our job to try and, as I say, we're far from perfect either. And it's not like none of our staff have biases. It's at this point, unfortunately, in society, it's impossible to avoid, but we are trying to tease out and make sure that referrals that we open up to look into further, to investigate, that's done as fairly as possible. We've talked a lot about that, so I won't go over that slide again. This is important. So we have at work, we actually have 4. It says, I think here we have 3, but we actually have 4 teams of workers who work with Indigenous families. There's some local bands. There's the Oneida Nation of the Thames, Munsee Delaware, and Chippewa of the Thames First Nation. We work a lot with those communities. There are special things under the legislation that we absolutely have to follow. They have certain rights that are enshrined in the legislation. As I say, they're working towards having their own children's aid, which everyone thinks in a perfect world it would happen years ago, but it's quite complex, and there are some tangible steps. There's an Indigenous agency that in the last few years has become licensed to provide their own foster care or group care when that's needed. That was a massive step forward. So sometimes people might think that there's not really anything concrete happening. There absolutely are things. We've had people from the Indigenous community who have the education that's needed to do the roles. We've had their staff actually working in our building and shadowing our staff to learn certain things or to see how things are done. So there are concrete things happening, but there's a lot further to go. We have things called people who are called band reps. So if a family identifies as Indigenous, we need, before we're even in touch with the family or going out to the home, if that's what's needed, we're working with a band rep from one of those local Indigenous communities, and we're transparent. All the information we share with them. There's joint planning about how the situation is going to be involved. Band reps can make sure that family's cultural identity is being respected, and that the services, if there's services that need to be put in place, that's being done from a culturally matched and suitable perspective versus us sort of laying on our own ideas. And that rules are extremely strict, as they should be, around this. So if you do happen to make a referral about a child or family, or if there's one person in a family who's Indigenous, that can trigger us needing to work with a band rep. It can sometimes slow things down. That's just the way it is. It takes time to engage with other people and work with them and do joint planning and problem solving, but it's critically important. So that's just something to be aware of. There's, again, we can never cover all the information in these slides, but there's the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. Oh, sorry, a question, Erin?
Yeah, a question has just come up in the Q&A box on the previous slide. Chelsea is just wondering, what would be an example of something that is a safe alternative parenting practice, but might be misunderstood as harm?
That's a good question. The one that jumps to mind is, in some cultures, older children have more parenting responsibilities for younger siblings than a Caucasian family. I mean, you can't generalize, but than a Caucasian family might have. There's not really absolutes, but in some cultures, like maybe a 12-year-old child might have what someone else might see to be a lot of parenting responsibility, and it could be viewed by others to be abusive in a way, or not letting the child explore their own, spend time with friends or pursue interests or spend time on homework or those kinds of things. But if that's the cultural norm, and sometimes there can be some necessity around that. What we look at is not so much do they have parenting responsibility, but what's the child's perception of that parenting responsibility. If the child sees that as normal and it's not upsetting them or impacting them, that it might be a non-issue, even though it might not be someone else's choice to have a child be that responsible. Having said that, that doesn't mean that if a family's from a different culture and older kids tend to have a lot of parenting responsibility, it doesn't mean the sky's the limit. Like if it's just clearly too much or responsibility, that's like, an example would be a special medically fragile child who's a year old, and maybe a 14-year-old sibling is left to look after them, but doesn't have the knowledge or the skills to be able to provide what they need. Just because they're from a different culture doesn't mean that's okay. Or if a child is feeling huge pressure and it's impacting their social development because they can't spend any time with friends, and that older child is upset about the responsibility they have, we might need to look at it. But it's just by the fact that it's happening doesn't mean it's can't happen or shouldn't happen, or that we're going to intervene and say 12-year-old can't look after their siblings, kind of thing.
Right. Okay. Thank you for answering that. And thank you, Chelsea, for the question. I'll leave you back to it.
Definitely. Okay, thanks. As far as Indigenous matters go, the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, because of things we'll talk about as the presentation goes on with colonization and residential schools. So there's been an official apology issued, but it's not just it's not just we're sorry kind of thing. There's a ton of steps after that to try and to work past that, or I mean, some things can't be fixed in hindsight, but to have a lot better culturally sensitive approach moving forward. That doesn't do it justice. But there's a massive amount of work, and it's slow. The one quote that stuck in my mind, I was at some training a few months ago, but an Indigenous person who was at the meeting said, progress happens at the speed of trust. And I just thought it was such a powerful quote, because there's been so many times over well over 100 years where trust has been broken with Indigenous people, and that it's progress can be made and it is being made, but to reestablish trust happens on so many levels. I mean, at organizational levels, societal levels, but in individual working relationships, when we're working with the band reps, that's why it's so important that we're transparent and sharing all the information. I'll leave it at that for now, because we could talk for all afternoon about that. So this is getting into some things specifically to do with your responsibilities, not just as a working in a professional capacity, whether you're in student teaching placements or field placements or whatever you call them, but also in your private lives as neighbors, friends, family members, that any person who has what's called reasonable grounds to suspect a child might be in need of protection has a duty to report. There's a part in here about fines. I don't want to minimize that. I wouldn't worry about being fined if you don't report something generally. I mean, common sense prevails. I can tell you where fines might come into play. If there's someone like I keep using this example, a doctor, and they have very specific knowledge, and it's crystal clear that maybe parents weren't providing the medical care a child needed, and it was quite obvious. And if someone with a high degree of responsibility, specialized responsibility, doesn't report, that could potentially lead to a fine. I'm not aware. I've worked for Children's Aid for many years. I'm not aware through London of someone ever being fined for not reporting something. We go at it more from a teaching perspective, and we do follow up with things, not just with professionals, but with community members too. If there's a fairly glaring thing that should have been reported or should have been reported sooner, we do follow up with people from an educational perspective. Our goal isn't to try and get people fined. And as I say, I'm not aware. I am aware of our senior people at our agency for repeat problems with the same person, or people in really specialized positions who completely missed the boat and shouldn't have, that there's been some more formal follow-up done. But that's not, again, I'm not trying to say don't worry about it. You do need obviously to be conscientious and as careful as you can be about reporting, but I just don't want people losing sleep that our first thing to do is looking to fine people, because that's not the first approach at all. If there's some immediate issue, still report to us, but if it's like an immediate health and safety issue, 911 is the number to be calling first, and then you can follow up by making a report to us. So reasonable grounds, this is really important. It's basically you're just an honest judgment. We have next to no issues with professionals making reports they shouldn't make. Sometimes we might not think we need to really do anything. We'll always document, like every call we get in is documented. And that's hugely important. And we'll talk some more about that later. But as long as you're coming at it from a good faith perspective and basically doing the best you can do with the knowledge you have, that's what's really the expectation as far as reasonable grounds go. It's not, you don't need to worry about if it's 100% true or not, or you don't need to worry about if it's to prove there's an issue. You just need to have some valid concern based on your professional judgment, or your personal judgment too, just based on life experience, if it's not in your role as a teacher. We've talked about some of these things.
Kevin, there is a question in
Okay.
the
Yep.
Q&A box.
Mhm.
I also noticed some people have been raising their hands. So if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A box because that's the easiest way for us to keep the session flowing. But the question that we have now is, would underage drug use or alcohol consumption of a minor with the knowledge of their parent or guardian require intervention from Children's Aid?
I would say possibly. The quick answer is if you have a concern like that, it definitely should be reported. Other factors, and I won't belabor them now, we'll talk about it more as we go on, but we look at things like history, or does it seem to be an isolated thing? So we do get cases, and they're not, well, it's not unusual to hear that a parent's actually providing minors with some kind of substances, not just alcohol, but sometimes actually quite serious drugs or marijuana or whatever the case may be. So it's generally something that you should report. And again, what we do with that, we certainly open up cases just for that reason, like for that reason alone, not to minimize it, but for that reason alone. So yeah, it could be reportable. Supervision, people think supervision only applies to young little kids, but technically our act covers parents need to provide appropriate supervision even for adolescents. Now that can be harder to do, obviously, because if an adolescent decides to leave house, I mean, the parent's can't be locking them in the house or kind of wrestling them to stay home, but still there are expectations about, because we hear about cases where I sort of call it on autopilot, where a teenager's on autopilot and the parent doesn't really know where the child is, hasn't seen them for a week, doesn't really know where they are, what they're doing. So that's, even though they're an adolescent, that's still an issue that can fall under our mandate. So that's kind of the quick answer to that question.
Awesome, thank you.
We've talked about most of those things. Privacy, quick answer about this is there's with good reason under the Education Act. I don't know it in detail, but under our own legislation, there's tons of privacy legislation, but your duty to report, you don't need to worry about privacy issues. If you're concerned about a child and their safety, you can absolutely refer it. And it's not like you need a consent, or you don't need to worry that you're going to be in some kind of trouble for breaching some kind of privacy legislation. That's the quick answer to that. Ongoing duty to report is really important. I can't stress this enough. So it can be frustrating for us. Sometimes we get repeated referrals, and just because the nature of the information, we're not able to do a lot about it. It doesn't mean we don't try, but sometimes we just can't. Once we do decide there's enough to investigate, we can't prove on a balance of probabilities. So basically to be 51% sure that there's an issue doesn't mean there isn't an issue. It just means we can't prove that there's an issue to the degree we need to potentially have some involuntary involvement by looking at possible court intervention. It can be frustrating, not just for teachers, but for community members, family members, other professionals. It can be frustrating because you might feel like you've reported something once or twice or even 3 times and nothing happens. So sometimes people might stop reporting, but even if you know the case is open to us, you need to keep reporting new concerns, or if concerns aren't getting better, like if there's issues with chronic neglect at school and kids are always hungry or just don't have, it's winter and they don't have clothing that's going to protect them from the elements, and you've reported it, and a couple of weeks later it's still going on, kids are still hungry, or kids still are too cold and are in danger, they might get frostbite or something, or something serious might happen because they don't have adequate clothing. If you keep having concerns, please keep reporting them. And it's kind of beyond please, there's actually a legislated duty to report ongoing concerns if things don't seem to be getting better. Can someone else call? This is important for teachers. It used to be, when I was on the front line a long time ago, used to be calls to Children's Aid would get filtered through a principal or a vice principal. So if the principal or vice principal didn't think that the teacher should call us, it often would end there. Now you specifically need to report yourself. You don't need someone else's permission, whether it's a principal, supervisor, other colleagues. If you're concerned about a child, then you have the duty to report. there should be less and less. We still hear about it sometimes. We occasionally will hear teachers say that the principal didn't think we needed to be called. But again, the duty really is on the individual person to report if they think they need to report. And also it's a direct reporting. So in a bind, in an emergency, if you just need to be with a child or be in class and you just can't report it, someone else could start the ball rolling by getting in touch with us. But eventually we're going to want to speak with the person with the direct knowledge of the information, because that person will be able to answer specific questions better than other people, because we're always worried about information being lost in the transmission from person to person. This is a good thing. For years, our field was advocating age of protection used to go up to really 16 years old. We had some involvement with kids older than that. Just in the last few years, the age of protection was finally raised to the age of 18. Reason it's important, some of the highest risk people we work with are adolescents and babies. People might not think adolescents are as at much risk, but when you look at some of the serious mental health concerns some of the adolescents have, some serious substance use issues, some intimate partner violence issues in relationships, which there's likely some overlap with the previous presentation. But we're quite pleased that the age of protection was raised up to 18. Some differences. So 16 and 17-year-olds don't have to work with us if they decline our service. It's extremely difficult to force our involvement with youth that age. And once a child's 16, you don't technically have a mandatory duty to report. We still strongly encourage it. We always will try and, depending on the circumstances, we'll definitely try and engage with the 16-year-old or 17-year-old. Again, if the circumstances are serious, we don't necessarily, if they tell us to get lost right away, if circumstances are serious, we don't necessarily just, stop trying to work with them right away. We will try and, as best we can, engage with them, because sometimes it takes some time for them to trust us or get to know us a bit better, to be prepared to share information, or to actually work with basically someone who starts out to be a stranger. But I'd strongly encourage, even though the reporting is not mandatory, I'd strongly encourage it. Prenatal, especially for kids who are a little bit older, people can become pregnant at quite a young age, potentially. Again, you're not obligated to make referrals if the child hasn't been born yet. We do emphasize if there are concerns, whatever that may be, mental health or substance issues or housing issues, or how they're going to provide material supplies for the baby, the longer lead time we have, the better. Now, having said that, even if you do make a report, it's completely voluntary until the baby is born. Service is completely voluntary, but some of these pregnancies are super high risk as far as if there's serious mental health or drug use concerns or developmental issues, sometimes serious criminal involvement. So the longer we have to plan with the prospective parent, the better, because we can look at building in supports, or if it's early in the pregnancy and person has time during the pregnancy to actually hopefully become engaged in counseling around mental health issues or addiction issues, so that there'll be more options once the baby's born, as far as that person being safely able to parent the child if that's what they're wanting to do. So involvement is voluntary and you don't have to report, but for those kinds of things, if you can engage with the person who's pregnant to have it be a collaborative thing, that would be a thing where if it would be helpful maybe to call together, if you can engage the person to both be on the phone, like on speaker or something, from a private place when the referral's made, so that the person can express their views directly, or maybe can answer some questions directly. But so people know, you certainly can make, if you have concerns about what will happen once the baby's born, you can definitely refer before the baby's actually born. I'm going to jump back. If someone's a super quick reader, you might be able to, you might have jumped ahead to some stats, but what group of people in the community do you think would, I'll just maybe finish this thing and then I'll take the question, but what group of people in the community, as far as neighbors or family members or police or whoever it might be, do you think would be our largest referral source? I'll just take answers for that question and cover one more stat, and then I'll get to the question that's on the floor there. Just any guesses, doesn't matter, just make a guess who our biggest referral source is.
So Kevin, they can't actually interact back to you.
Sure.
They can, oh, but they're putting things in the Q&A chat. So someone has said teachers are a potential demographic.
Yep.
Neighbors.
It's teachers is the biggest, it's the biggest referral source. So I won't kind of belabor that because it's a little tricky to interact that way, but and it's not surprising because you think how many school age kids are in London and how well teachers know, as I was saying before, how well that they get to know personal circumstances of kids, and kids trust, I mean, they generally trust their teachers or feel comfortable talking to teachers, and it's generally kids find that a safe place to disclose information. They might not have an opportunity to otherwise disclose information. Some of the other big referral sources are police, doctors, public health nurses, hospitals, friends, neighbors, family members, another huge source, but teachers is the single largest group. Just before I go to the next slide, if I can answer the question that Erin has.
Sure. So this question is from Kate. So we often hear that we should not confuse poverty with neglect. The winter coat and lunch examples reminded me of this. Where can we refer families in poverty for supplies they might need? And if this does not improve a situation, is it then neglect?
That's a great question, and it'll be covered somewhat. It's a little tricky to make so poverty itself it's associated with child neglect and maltreatment, but it's not a cause, because we work with tons of people who have quite limited means, but they're great parents. They have great parenting skills. They're in affordable housing. They're connected with all kinds of community supports for practical, like there's different meal programs in the city, food bank, schools themselves. It's quite powerful when you see schools provide incredible supports, I don't know how it works, but they seem to have some kind of a budget, or I think teachers frankly probably just might contribute some of their own resources for kids. I mean, they can't do that all the time to feed a child all the time, but trying to think the resources. Food bank for food is one of the main ones. There's an organization called Lifespin. Salvation Army, I know, has some different meal programs. If you look on there's a resource online called the Health Line, and you can look at resources about housing. Housing is it's a horrible stumbling block, not just in London, but it's with the people. It's been in the media. It's not a surprise, but the rents are so unaffordable, and people are on Ontario Works or disability pensions. It's next to impossible for people without some kind of additional assistance to basically make ends meet. But I'm not sure if I'm answering I think the thing is, if kids are, it might not be the best, it might not be sort of straight by the Canada's food guide as far as the nutrition. If they have adequate food, it might not be perfect, or it might not be what some people are able to provide. But if we don't want to see any kids hungry, but if kids are aren't hungry and are getting as reasonable a diet as parents can provide with the means they have and accessing some of these community resources. But that's different than if a child's hungry all the time, or if the child's getting frostbite, or the child is just, the winter's a more prime example, because you can be obviously harmed or die if you're outside too long and don't have proper clothing. But there's like I know the Boys and Girls Club used to have called the Coats for Kids program. There's just a ton of, unfortunately, it's a bit fragmented, but there are a ton of community resources. As I say, the Healthline is a good, if you just look on the Healthline, it can give an idea about specific, because it differs in different areas of the city. It varies by age groups of kids. There's just so many things. We can sometimes make suggestions if you call us, but if you try the Healthline first, there are a lot of resources. I'm not sure if that answers your question enough. It's complicated because the dividing line between what people doing the best they can do it. Another super quick example that's jumped to mind. When I was on the front line years ago, we used to make an issue about overcrowded residences. I think we're better now. People unfortunately live in crowded living situations because of affordability. Kids share bedrooms. There might be a few kids in a bedroom. There might be 7 or 8 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment. Our bottom line is it actually dangerous? It might not obviously be ideal. The overcrowding might lead to stress and cause, if someone already has a pre-existing mental health condition, overcrowding and that stress or lack of privacy, like that can cause stress and issues. But I always say to people I supervise, what's dangerous? Like, it's not nice and it's stressful, but if people have safe sleeping arrangements and older kids have some degree of privacy in their sleeping arrangements, we wouldn't say it's dangerous or it's not ideal, but we're not going to intervene in that. Years ago, we might have done more, but people just don't have a choice. There's hardly any options, and people are stuck with not great circumstances.
Okay, Kate says that does help, so thank you for your response. And Alyssa has shared a link to the Southwest Healthline website,
Oh,
so
that's great.
I'll post that in the same section as the answered questions.
Oh, thanks for doing that. I'm going to jump ahead to the next slide. So this might be surprising for people, but so the statistic is that nearly 50% of all substantiated investigations. So what a substantiated investigation is, if we get a referral someone, we're not always able to open the case, or sometimes our phone screeners do over the phone work with families to do just the thing we've been talking about, making sure they're aware of community programs. Because if there's a program in the community that can provide a service or can provide some assistance with material needs, Children's Aid doesn't need to be involved and shouldn't be involved. But once we do decide to complete a child protection investigation, about half of all those involve some kind of intimate partner violence, whether it's verbal, sexual, emotional, usually it's by a male parent towards a female parent, but not always. That's not always the case. To me, it's a mind-boggling statistic, and unfortunately, through the pandemic, that's actually become worse. I'm not sure this is a fairly up-to-date statistic. It may not factor in the pandemic, but the pandemic, people already in abusive relationships, when we had the lockdowns and things like that, and just about public health recommendations and people following them or not following them, or one partner's interpretation of if another person's following them, it just opened up a whole new series of factors to do with people's isolation or being, people used to be able to get out and be safe when they were out of the home, but when people were on lockdown, unfortunately, it made things much worse. Another important statistic is, and this might surprise people, but only 3% of the investigations we do lead to children and youth needing to live with a friend or family member for a period of time or be living in one of our foster homes or group homes. So it's a smaller number than it used to be. I'm not sure what it used to be, but it's definitely a smaller number, and it's a tiny percentage of the people we're worked with. The community perception may be that as soon as we're involved, or many times we're involved, kids can't live with their families and need to be elsewhere, but we've become better and better and better and have more resources ourselves to support kids living with their own families, so that the need to be in our care isn't nearly as big as it used to be, and our workers stand on their heads basically to find alternate solutions, because it's not sometimes it's necessary and it is a quick fix, but it just brings up a host of other problems, and there's not, unfortunately, great success rates when kids are in our care. That's not to say like many of our kids in care do amazingly well, but it triggers a bunch of other difficulties. So if we can avoid that, we avoid it. And referrals under duty to report we've talked about these different kinds of things, but doesn't have to be active abuse. Like physical abuse might be the thing that jumps to people's mind, but it can be neglect, physical harm, risk of physical harm, emotional harm, risk of emotional harm, exposure to intimate partner violence, and then all the different sexual abuse concerns that can come up. And human trafficking, there's another slide about this, but we have some more powers now to be able to intervene in human trafficking situations. And might not be a surprise to you, and there's been a lot of media coverage, but in London there is a lot of human trafficking happening in London. Part of it's because we're on the 401 corridor. A lot of the hotels near the 401, there's significant problems with that. And it's not unusual on the team I supervise anymore to actually have referrals to do with young adolescents, like 12, 13 years old, where they're either are being trafficked or there's a high risk of them being trafficked. Maybe a case or two I've heard of, not on my team, but even a year or two younger than that. So it's something that unfortunately people need to keep in mind. So we talk about, I mean, a lot of referrals are to do with parents, step parents, community caregiver. Because of you being at Althouse, I wanted to focus on this. So teachers would be considered to be a community caregiver. There's different steps we take. We actually have a team at work. We do have some investigations to do with teachers, school bus drivers, daycare, people who work in daycares, sports coaches and things like that. Like they can all potentially be called community caregivers. Some of the things, if we look at history, if we do get a referral about concerns about a teacher, we look at history. Sometimes we have history to do with a specific teacher that we've done previous investigations. We'll look at those referrals differently because we do need to factor in history and whether we've substantiated or not substantiated the past concerns. And I'll get to the question in just a sec. Sometimes quite a few of the referrals we get to do with teachers, we're in touch with the HR department at the Board of Ed, because they're able to share some history with us. A lot of things we leave for the school to deal with as a might call it a performance issue or an HR issue or a training issue or a teaching issue about better ways to deal with certain things. But if there is history or if it's a more serious concern, we do need to do investigations to do with not just teachers, but other support staff in the school potentially. And as I say, most of those investigations are done by a different team of workers who have some more experience and interest in doing those kinds of investigations. A lot of times, for more serious things, I think you call it Federation, Teachers Federation, or the Teachers Union will be involved in helping to represent a teacher through that, so that they have some support and they're not going through that kind of on their own. I'll take the question. It's a good chance for a question.
Sure. So on the last slide, you mentioned some statistics. So Amber is asking if only 21% of the substantiated investigations are neglect and 19% of them are abuse, what's the cause behind the other 60%?
Let me look I just want to see how that's worded. this might not be the best answer, but yeah, it's probably not. I honestly can't speak to the details of those stats. It could be that it talks about, it could be other substance use, some of the things I mentioned at the very beginning, some things like substance use that can lead to neglect. So I'm thinking it's probably things where there's serious mental health concerns, serious substance use issues that, as I say, can lead to neglect. So those conditions might be so concerning that they're leading to a risk of some kind of abuse or neglect, or it could be actual abuse or neglect too. But that's it's a good question, because it's not, it could be more clear. I'm just trying to think so a quick stat is, and this holds true over decades, of the cases we open and investigate, we transfer for longer term service about 25% of the cases we investigate. So the other 75% are closed at the level I work at, like the intake level. So we might do some short-term work with people, referring people to agencies, or find out it seems to have been a malicious referral from a neighbor or something like that. Trying to think, from my own day-to-day experience, most of the things we transfer have to do with some kind of intimate partner violence. It's very, very common for intimate partner violence to be paired with some kind of a mental health or an addictions issue. Those not always, but they often go hand in hand. And lack of follow through with developmental treatment, medical treatment, that's not super common, but it's not unusual either. Risk of kids coming into our care. So parents at their wits end with a teenager. We have quite a few of those. I see those, I don't have the stat, but anecdotally, I see that as having increased during the pandemic. People trying to juggle work, or being in close quarters, or trying to support their kids with home schooling, or like the online schooling during the pandemic. In my mind, we've had a significant increase in parents just being at the end of the rope with adolescents, and some serious behaviors, like where it's more the parent almost who needs protection, because kids are assaulting parents, seriously assaulting parents, assaulting siblings, risk of assaulting siblings. So a lot of cases about high risk babies in high risk environments. We transfer quite a few newborn babies until community supports can kick in, or until we can build up some trust and confidence that substance use issues or mental health issues or lack of knowledge issues can be ameliorated to the point where we don't think there's enough risk to keep the file open. It's not a perfect answer, because I realize the slide could be more clear. It's actually the first time someone's noticed that. So
No, that's okay. It sounds like there's probably a combination of different factors that impact the other 60%. So it's probably not, one thing is 60% of the reasons. So
exactly.
lots of
Yeah.
different opportunities. So thank you for answering that. I know we're in the last half hour of the presentation, so I'll hold the remaining questions, if there are any, until the end for you.
Sure, that's helpful. That's great.
Okay.
I'm just having a quick look. Yeah, we should be good. Neglect, and this has come up, and this hopefully will expand a little bit more. We try to work with people voluntarily. If we can't, what's key for us is to be able, if there is a pattern of neglect, so it's not isolated things, not that it's great, but sometimes people, when it's getting close to payday, they might have run out of money and can't get food, so they have minimal food for a day or two, or some temporary stress. Maybe someone in the family has died, and there's been a lot of family stress, and the parents have just had difficulty keeping up with the kids' needs, but it's time limited, and there's not a reason to think that people aren't going to move beyond that, or be able to get some help from family members, or maybe go to the food bank to get food. So a lot of people have these sort of isolated or short-term things, and it may be every month, but it's for a very short time, and the kids, their nutrition might not be great for a day or two, versus kids are always hungry, or their hygiene's to a point where they're being ostracized by peers or bullied by peers because of hygiene or completely inadequate clothing that just doesn't fit and it's winter or completely not warm enough kind of thing. This is a key thing for teachers. Absences from school, they can be a giant red flag. Can be driven by all kinds of family stress for all the kinds of things we've talked about. Truancy itself, it's difficult, and I'll tell you kind of how we look at it. Ideally, kids would attend all the time and not be late. One of the first questions we ask if a teacher refers about attendance concerns, one of the first questions we're going to ask is, have you involved a attendance counselor? Or has the school tried to work directly with parents? Occasionally, usually schools are great, but occasionally we do get calls and the school hasn't tried to contact the parent about the absence concerns. They haven't involved the attendance counselor. So we would usually ask that people take those steps first. We do transfer cases and occasionally we'll go to court for cases to do with absences, but just so you know, it needs to be quite serious to the point of kids way behind and it affecting their social development and their peer relationships because they're just so far behind from the absences. That's not to say we don't try and work on things, but if push comes to shove, it's very difficult. It's not impossible, and we certainly do it, but it's very difficult to if parents won't work with us to try and solve the issues. It's very difficult to actually, and especially through the pandemic with all the homeschooling and people being in that boat, and some parents have struggled getting kids because they got into new routines with the pandemic. It's been really difficult behaviorally for some parents to have their kids go back to school. Homeschooling is we won't dwell on it, but it's a bit of one of my pet peeves. We work with some people who do great at homeschooling. The parents do great. They're well prepared. They have the ability to do the homeschooling. They're quite structured around it, and the kids are it seems like, not like we're the experts to judge education, but it seems like the kids are being educated adequately in that environment. Not sure if you would know, I see homeschooling to be a massive loophole, and a lot of the people we work with are well aware of the loophole. So they'll go through, there's a bit of a process to go through to get permission to homeschool. The issue in my view, and I'm not an expert in it, but in my view, the enforcement of homeschooling it's next to nothing. We can be aware that parents are doing minimal, if any, homeschooling once they've had permission, and it's super tough to do much about that. That's not to say we don't try and encourage. It's a particular, well, it's issue for lots of kids, but sometimes we have kids with very special needs, like with autism or FASD, and it can be a challenge for people with tons of training and skills and experience to provide appropriate education for some of these kids with special learning needs. And for someone who's not spending much or any time doing that, it's clear to us kids aren't getting what they need. But it can be, not, again, there's some things we can do, and it's not that we don't try, but it can be really difficult to actually pursue things like that, just so you know. Physical harm, it's pretty obvious if a child's saying to you that they have some kind of an injury, or it doesn't even have to be a visible injury. If a child's saying their neck's really sore from some kind of a physical punishment thing happening by a parent, even if there's not a visible injury, or a child saying they have a really bad headache from maybe being hit in the head, or really bad stomach ache from being hit in the stomach, even if you don't know if there's an injury or can't see an injury, obviously that's reportable. Some teachers are frequently asking kids just how did they get a certain injury, and there can be, a reasonable explanation for even a black eye or something, maybe from a sibling, and you don't have a reason not to think that's true, and it seems to be credible what the child's saying. Some of the injuries are more suspicious, like on like ears. It's unusual to have an accidental injury to an ear. It's possible, but a little bit more suspicious. Again, injuries on young kids who are super active on shins, and that again doesn't mean it's not some form of abuse if there's injuries on the shins. But if a child has a bruise on their shin and they say they whatever fell, tripped outside, or hit it against a tree when they're running around in a yard or something, like might not be any reason to think it's more than that. But um, some of the sometimes a child just can't remember how they got injured because they're so active and they get so many injuries, or it might have been a week ago and they truly don't remember. But sometimes if they're saying they can't remember, it's more they do remember, they just don't feel comfortable sharing that information. Some of these other indicators, there can be so many reasons for, like highly aggressive or withdrawn. It could be many things. Doesn't mean obviously that they're being physically abused. The injuries that don't fit the explanation, this can be something to really focus in on and pay some attention to. If there's a huge bruise on a child's leg or something, and child says they're 6-month-old, just for an extreme example, their 6-month-old sibling hit them and caused this giant bruise on their leg, that's probably not true. Like the odds of a 6-month-old being able to cause a significantly large bruise doesn't probably make sense. Things that don't developmentally fit, you won't see this as much because you're working with school age kids, but I don't know if someone said, oh, this 9-month-old was climbing a tree and fell out of the tree and that's how they hurt themselves. Obviously that's kind of a ridiculous example, because short of someone setting a child up in a tree and then the child fell, but obviously a child that age isn't going to be able to climb. That's an extreme example, but just something that doesn't make sense developmentally. Or we don't often see these, fortunately, but sometimes there will actually be an outline that looks like it might be from a handprint on a bum, or occasionally a face or something. And if it's clearly a large hand, and if they're saying their little brother, whose hand would be like a quarter that size, caused the injury, it just doesn't make sense. So that's kind of common sense. And but if it's always better to report than not report if you're not sure. Emotional harm, I'm not going to spend much time, because this list of things, like red flags like helpless, avoidance, self-blame, there can be so many reasons for that. The emotional harm, you're more likely to have concerns based on something a child's actually saying, like a parent calls them awful names, or a parent is emotionally abusive to them, telling them they're stupid and no good. And unfortunately it's not that unusual to hear those kinds of things. So, or you're going to actually see a parent's behavior where parent might not realize it's not appropriate, or they're so used to being emotionally inappropriate with the child, they don't kind of have the filters. And even around professionals like teachers, they might engage in behavior that you think is quite obviously concerning. So it's more going to be based on what kids say or what you observe parents to be doing than some of these softer indicators, in my experience. Intimate partner violence, we've talked some about. So if you're hearing that kids have witnessed one of their parents being harmed by another parent physically, if kids are talking about parents being put, like these emotional put downs, insults, controlling behaviors, if you're hearing things like that, even if, and not to minimize, but if it's hearing from another room, if they're not actually seeing it, if they're hearing about it after, sometimes unfortunately kids are seeing a parent be injured, and that can be traumatic, obviously, for a child to see their parent with injuries. They're worried about their parent, if they're going to be okay, or it's just upsetting to see their parent harmed. Even if a child's not there when it happens, if they're seeing injuries after the fact, it would still be reportable. And again, a lot of times police are involved, and we hear about these in another way, or from neighbors or family members, or sometimes the client themselves calls us for assistance. But sometimes the only disclosure in the community is a child saying something at school and no one else really knows about it, or other people might know about it but haven't reported. So just to be aware of that. Sometimes you'll hear, a parent might, sometimes parents say something themselves directly to a teacher, like a parent might say to a teacher that they were harmed by their partner and they just want somebody to know about it. And that does happen sometimes. And they may say, oh, the child didn't know anything about it because the child was asleep or something. It would still be worth reporting to us, because we can look at history and we can possibly do some things, even if occasionally kids will sleep through some of these things. But when you read the details of some of these things that happen, the chances of a child sleeping through something are slim. I'll let people read through the different sexual abuse is something that there's been so much emphasis for decades now. We think it's actually reduced in incidents because of strong reporting about sexual concerns, sometimes before things progress to more, to more serious things along the continuum. And I think my sense is that there's a sense that the community finds out about these things and deals with these things, and people end up being charged, or we end up getting court orders to protect kids for whatever the reason is. Treatment is part of it, some successful treatment with people, but it's something that I don't have current stats. I did see stats a few years ago that things are actually down, and they're thinking the stats are down because there's actually less of the sexual abuse happening versus just it not being reported or not being discovered. And things, it can be what we call grooming behaviors, because oftentimes things start as things that can seem innocuous, whether it's sort of brushing by or things that don't necessarily seem sexual, like paying special treatment to a child, or giving them gifts, or giving a child privileges that other siblings don't have. And sometimes you might see interactions that just don't look comfortable, or a parent forcing physical affection that doesn't seem appropriate, or the child's not comfortable with. And some of the things are going to be more clear. If a child saying something clearly inappropriate has happened, then clearly that's reportable. So just roughly a year ago, our act was changed so that we have some more powers to intervene in human trafficking things to do with kids and youth under 18. One different thing. So if you're hearing, if you have concerns about kids spending time at hotels, about, it can be peers, like who seem to have lots of money or seem to be getting lots of inducements from friends, like supplied with drugs, supplied with expensive clothing or electronic equipment, things like that. It's definitely want to sort of pay some more attention to that. And again, if you're concerned, it's best to report it, and we'll sort out what some steps might be able to be taken. We have got a couple people who've had pretty extensive training and have significant interest and skills in this area. I work quite closely with one of the women. She's a colleague of mine who's a supervisor as well, and she and one of the people on her team have been to extensive training, and we have some risk tools that they're able to administer to help us sort things out. The key difference to highlight here: we can intervene. Most of the things are caregiver based. We can have concerns that a child or youth is being trafficked, and the caregiver might not be aware of the concerns, or they might be doing all they can possibly do, but it's the only thing I'm aware of where we can interfere in it. Intervene rather. And it's not because of a concern that a parent's engaging the child in trafficking, or they might be doing the best they can do, but we can intervene even if a parent, whether a parent's aware or not, or even a parent's doing the best they can do, because some of these forces are quite powerful to overcome. But the legislation now lets us have some more powers to intervene in that. Covered that. So basically in London, if you have concerns, call the local Children's Aid Society. I'm just keeping a bit of an eye on time. I'm going to quickly go through because I want to make sure there's room for questions at the end. When we're a designated French language agency, not all of our screeners are bilingual, and it can take some more time, but there's always access to a staff who is bilingual if that is if that helps facilitate the referral. When you do call, if you can do your best to have as much demographic information as you can, birth dates, home address, parents' phone numbers, if you have an email address, sibling information, if you know there's siblings going to different school, have as much demographic information as you can when you call. It may seem like a ton of questions, and it is a ton of questions. We have all the what's called standards, and we're obligated, and there's good reason for all the questions we ask. So if you try and bear with us, because we're going to ask a ton of questions. If you don't know something, you don't know it. Just do the best you can. Just do the best you can do. As a teacher, we call them professional referral sources. They're generally expected to identify themselves. There can be some exceptions. Sometimes a school might be the family's only source of community support. Some families are incredibly isolated. They just don't have family in the city or in the country. Sometimes pretty much all their families died. Some people just don't have friends. So if you're concerned that if a person finds out that the school made the report, people might guess anyway, but sometimes, a lot of times we just tell the family the school called, and we educate families about people's duty to report and say whoever called at the school had no choice. That was their legal obligation, and try and take the kind of pressure off the people who did report. Most of our referrals, we say the school called. Occasionally a teacher's fine with their name being shared with the family. So that's an exception when we might not identify that even the school called, as if that's the only source of support. We're worried about fracturing the relationship if we identify the school as the referral source. Doesn't happen very often, but there can be safety concerns to do with a parent. If a parent's been assaultive or aggressive at school or out of control at school, maybe in the past, or has been threatening towards staff, that might be a reason for us not to identify that the school called or that a specific teacher called. So there are exceptions, but generally we expect professionals to be identified as, at least to say this, the school called. As I say, even if we don't say that, a lot of times people will guess because the information could only have come from someone at school. I won't, this will be in the presentation. I'm not going to talk about it at all. As far as privacy legislation, it kind of goes on and on. If someone's specifically interested, there's a couple of websites that you can look at to do with that. Sometimes when we get a referral, we'll open a case to investigate. Sometimes, as I say, we just document it. History is a massive, if people don't, you know your piece when you make a referral, but oftentimes we have massive amounts of information from other children's aids in the province, from other children's aids in the country, sometimes even in the States. And you can't know that history, but for all the calls we get, we're always looking at history. Sometimes there's been a couple calls in the last couple of weeks, but one in itself wasn't enough maybe to do something about. But when we look at the pattern of calls, we can do something about it. Sometimes we're aware the case might already be open. You might not know that. We can have massive amounts of information. So that's another key reason, because we can only consider your information and look at history if we get the call to begin with. We can't, because of privacy, we can tell you some things we're going to do. Like if we're going to come see a child at school and interview them, obviously we can tell you that, but we might be pretty limited. I have a bias. A lot of referrals a school makes, they're referrals that should have been needed to be made. When we look into it, there's some kind of a reasonable explanation, or families are quite receptive to feedback or to pursue community services. Sometimes there's some second or third hand information through another child at school, or there might be some malicious component to what another kid said or another parent said. I like to get families' permission to be able to follow up with the school, and if there didn't seem, or if there didn't seem to be anything to it, or there was a reasonable explanation for something, I like to be able to follow up with schools. We're not always able to do that because we need parents' permission to do that. I think it's better because I don't think it's fair to families. Like if we look into it and there's some reasonable explanation, I don't think it's right for a teacher to always have this question mark, wondering what happened or wondering if there was something to it or not to it. But again, we can't always follow up with the details, but we try when we can. It's something we could do better at, but we've covered that. This is the last thing I'll spend much time on, and I know we're starting to run out of time, unfortunately. I'm glad we've been able to answer some questions through it. If a child is disclosing something to you, as best you can, and everyone's human, obviously, but sometimes things you're hearing from kids can be really upsetting. Sometimes a child's very distraught. Sometimes it's just very difficult information to hear. As best you can, try and be as calm as you can, or not to show the child you're upset, because doing that can have them stop disclosing, or because they don't want to upset you, or they think they've done maybe something incorrect or something. Again, sometimes myself included, you're going to show some emotion, but just do the best you can. And the classic thing, try not to be using leading questions. Like, this is a kind of a extreme example, but if a child has a big bruise on their face versus just what happened, or how did you get the bruise, versus did your mom or dad hit you, or who hit you and caused that kind of thing. That's an extreme example, but some privacy too, because you want to avoid other kids or staff hearing something that they don't need to be hearing. Avoiding making promises can be a difficult thing, and I've been in this situation countless times. A child will say, well, because some of our kids have been in care before, some of them have been interviewed multiple times by Children's Aid, so some of them can be quite anxious. Some of them might have been coached or told, don't tell anyone what happens, and it kind of comes out by accident, or child just can't keep it contained anymore and feels the need to say something. And some kids will just say, am I going to have to go to a foster home, or are my parents going to get in trouble, or is one of my parents going to go to jail? And is it hard as it is? Because if you make a promise you can't keep, or if you tell them everything will be okay, or don't worry, you won't, no one's going to get in trouble with police, or you won't have to come into care, if the opposite turns out to be true, that it's going to erode the child's trust. So as hard as it is to do, just not to make those guarantees that you're not able to make, and letting us know right away as soon as you possibly can. It's difficult. Sometimes people have key information at the beginning of the day and we don't hear about it till the end of the day. We have less resources at the end of the day, like after hours. We can still do our job, but everything gets slowed down. We can't consult with as many people. Things may be more in a crisis because a child might have already gone home and there was information that we needed to be working on all day. If the information, sometimes it just comes out at the end of the day, there's nothing you can do about it, but if you can, let us know as soon as you possibly can. And we get that there's competing demands, or you can't leave your class instantly to make a referral, but if you do the best you can. And we get lots of self-referrals where parents call looking for help. That's, to me, the ideal, where it wouldn't be based on other people calling, that people would trust us and see us as a resource. And we absolutely do get self-referrals, which people might not realize. We've talked a bit about kinship, but we're legally obligated. It's not just something we try to do. We're legally obligated to look at, if a child can't safely be with parents, to look at friends and family members. So I'll leave it at that. We have a little bit of time to squeeze in a couple questions if there are any.
Yeah, so we do have one. If there are others, folks, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. So this one is, how can teachers let students and their families know that we are here to support them and that they can come to us or other school staff if they are in need of help? So how can we let them know, or how can we encourage them to do so if they're experiencing an abusive spouse or partner or parent caregiver?
You can There's a couple of things. You can always, one of the resources we work with extensively is ANOVA. It used to be called Women's Community House. Now it's called ANOVA. So Women's Community House and Sexual Assault Center merged, and they go under the umbrella term of ANOVA. They have 24-hour crisis line, community outreach workers. You can always let them know. And again, it's easily available online. Like there's a 24-hour crisis number they can call. And just by like the question almost partly answered itself by just saying, like you're school social workers, like my understanding is generally there's consent. There's some exceptions, but school social workers are a resource because those workers absolutely know the community resources, and you could just ask, would it be okay, or you think it might be helpful if a referral is made to the school social worker to look at some resources or some problem solving ideas and that. And many parents would rather work with the school or school social worker than us necessarily, just because of their fear of working with us or their sort of biases or perceptions. And some of those might be based in reality and some might not be, but does that that's a quick way to answer the
Yeah,
question.
no, I think so. There's no other questions that oh, yep, there is. 1 second, another one just came in. So the OCT professional advisory on the duty to report says that we have to let the children in our care know that they have rights because children may not know their rights and what constitutes abuse and neglect. So what does that look like?
The kind of global answer would be it's not okay for kids to be emotionally, physically, sexually harmed, and kids have a right to have their basic needs met as far as housing, food, shelter, and that part of your role is reporting concerns if those needs can't be met, or you think those needs aren't being met. And that Children's Aid, it's a huge part of our role to make sure they're met. There is depending on the age of the child, this wouldn't really be great for younger kids, but for adolescents, you can refer them to our website, because our website actually would have links to kids' rights. There's detailed information. There's a Office of the Ombudsperson. I mean, they specialize in kids' rights, so you wouldn't be expected to know in detail all those rights, but the basic ones, basically right to be safe from all those different kinds of abuse and neglect, and some resources for them. And again, if it you can refer a school social worker would be able to delve into some of those more if just a general answer isn't helpful for the student. School social worker and there's like school, this might not be the right term, but school support workers. There's some amazing school support workers. That's what I call, there might be newer terminology, but some of them might have retired now, but there's some just amazing school support workers that, and some, we get to know the ones in the higher needs schools, and that's just the way it is. Like Wilfred Jury is one that comes to mind, Aberdeen School, but those people have massive expertise in community resources and would have a sense of kids' rights and family supports that could be plugged in. They do many of the same things we can do, and they're not seen to be as generally as threatening a person to a family as Children's Aid would be. So families might be a lot more comfortable working with one of these school support workers. They're different than social workers. Sorry, I don't know the updated terminology. We just call them school support workers. I think they have like social service worker training would be my understanding. I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, we have a variety of different support workers in schools now. But I think that's a great answer for this question. And for the teacher candidates that are on the call, it's normal for you to be coming out of these sessions with more questions, because it's getting you to think and it's getting you to connect what you're learning from this session with what you're experiencing in practicum, especially now that you've been out to schools, with what you're learning in class. And so it is normal to kind of have these thoughts that are connecting now that you're gaining more experience as an educator. And so if you are coming out of these sessions with more questions, that's a good thing. And those are questions that you can bring to class. You can bring them to practicum, and you can chat with the network of educators and your peers that you're creating while you're in the program. So it is really productive to be having those questions.
Couple super quick things. You can always call and do what we call a run by. You can call with non-identifying information. So you're not obligated to give a student's actual name or parents' names. Oftentimes we'll say we really need that, but you can run a generic kind of a situation, like a well, not hypothetical, but just run information by us without giving us a name if you're not sure. Usually we're going to ask you to give the names because we can't really give an informed answer without checking history. So that's one option. The other option is Erin will have my contact. My email is the best way to get in touch with me. I'm open to further questions like by email. If you read through all the slides, if you still have questions, and I'd encourage you to look at our own website, but I'm completely open to, if you had a specific question we didn't have time to answer, I'm completely open to people emailing me, and if I don't know the answer, I know lots of people, I can always find someone who knows.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. So if you can share the slides with me, I can have those along with this recording available for the teacher candidates and your email. So that's great. We are just over time, so I do want to say thank you so much. I know we started a little bit late, so you're actually perfectly on time. So I do want to say thank you for presenting for us today. I really appreciated this presentation. I know it's a generic slideshow, so I appreciate that you were able to kind of localize it a little bit for us and provide some information and resources a little bit closer to home. I also appreciated some of the cultural context that you were able to include. I know that when I saw this presentation when I was in the BEd program a few years ago, it was more generic, and they weren't really considering different kinds of families and different kinds of lifestyles. So I do appreciate seeing that change. And yeah, just in general, thank you for the presentation, and I'm sure our teacher candidates are grateful as well. So we will end it there, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and all the best to everyone. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.